90.3 WHPC now presents Law You Should Know. The law affects every aspect of our lives, our home, our jobs, and our recreational activities. Now, learn about the law and how to protect yourself against the loss of your liberty or property, and learn how to stand up for your rights and seek compensation when you have been wronged. Your host for Law You Should Know is attorney Kenneth J. Landau, a past dean of the Nassau Academy of Law, and frequently lectures to lawyers on ethics and avoiding problems with clients, and to the public on how to choose and use lawyers. This is Law You Should Know on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.
Hi, this is Ken Landau, and welcome to Law You Should Know. This is part of one of our first shows for our 34th season of Law You Should Know. And I'd like to welcome our special guest, attorney Sandra M. Radna, who's a matrimonial attorney with offices in Melville, Long Island, and also in Manhattan. And she's going to discuss divorce after COVID. Welcome to Law You Should Know.
Thank you so much, Ken. I'm very happy to be here today.
And we're going to give our listeners some valuable information about what to expect if they or someone they know are thinking about divorce or going through a divorce or have problems from a past divorce. But as we emerge from COVID, how will that affect the world of divorce? Will there be more people getting divorced who may have cohabited or been estranged from their spouse during COVID? What do you think what will happen?
I don't know. I think during the pandemic, there was an increase in domestic violence because people were in the house together that maybe they were usually apart because they were at work and busy with their lives during the day. That, I think, has pretty much evened out because the world is, in the world of the court anyway, it's getting back to normal. One of the things that happened during the pandemic was the courts in New York were able to pivot to virtual appearances, meaning that they use something called Microsoft Teams for appearances, which has been good for certain things. Now that things have opened up more, many court appearances are in person, but some simple conferences like status conferences where there's not a lot substantively going on, the courts are still doing virtually, which is really great for the clients because they're not having to take a day off from work to go to court if it's just a routine appearance.
And do you think fewer people initiated divorce among all the other issues they had to deal with during COVID?
At different points in COVID, it was different. In the beginning, when the world was shut down and people were concerned about if they were going to be able to earn the incomes they were earning before, there were less divorces, even though there was an increase in domestic violence. As things started opening up again, divorces went back to where they were, and right now, divorces are very active.
And you think now people will, even as we emerge from COVID and people are more concerned about the quality of life or their situation in life or living situation, you think there'll be an uptick in divorce?
Well, I think that what there's been an uptick in is what's called gray divorces. And gray divorces are people that are over 50 years old that have been married for 25 years or maybe more than 20 years. And it used to be that people just stuck it out. They stayed in the marriage even if they were unhappy. And now more people are realizing, as people are living longer and people are more aware of taking advantage of what the quality of their life is, just like you mentioned, that maybe there is more life after an unhappy marriage. So that has actually increased, the statistics have shown.
And from your experience as a divorce lawyer for 25 years, is that something that you think is true? That people should bite the bullet and move on and try to give themselves a chance at a better life?
I think people deserve the right to be happy. And sometimes if you're in an unhappy marriage, that really consumes everything about you. You're not happy coming home. So I absolutely think that if people have the opportunity to live a happier life and the marriage isn't doing that for them, then absolutely, at any age, it's a good thing to do so that they get to live that happy life. I've had clients in their 60s who got divorced and remarried and are just so happy now, and it's great.
Or they may be happier being single, just
they might be
without the
happier.
stress of being married to someone you cannot get along with.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Just the peace of mind that they have of not having to worry about what's going to happen when they walk in the door with a fight or an accusation or just general unhappiness.
And maybe that opens unlimited possibilities. The same thing about quitting a job you really don't like and you don't think will get any better.
Absolutely.
Have trends in divorce changed? Are they more likely to be resolved? Is this going to be, do they go to divorce mediation, or it's a long, arduous adversarial process?
It depends. The courts are trying to more and more utilize mediation. The courts in New York, at least in Nassau and Suffolk County, have mediation programs that are free to the parties, which is a brand new program. It's worked very effectively. The people that are doing the mediations are people who either worked with judges or they may be retired judges themselves. And it really gives the clients, the parties, an opportunity to speak, which they don't always get to do when they go to court. And it's been very successful in my experience. Even in cases that look like they were impossible to resolve, the mediation's been working very well. So that is a trend towards the court, which I'm very happy to see.
And they also get a chance to speak and be heard and be acknowledged, because a judge is listening to certain evidence and relevance, but a mediator is more flexible.
Absolutely. The mediator is just there to try to get the parties to come to a resolution. They're a neutral party. They don't represent either person. And the other good thing about the mediation through the courts, it remains completely confidential. So if it doesn't work out, the judge is never going to hear that one party was being unreasonable while the other party was being reasonable. And because the judge is not involved, they're able to come into the trial with an open mind, waiting to hear all the evidence. So it's a great program.
And it may result in cost savings, because you may not have to pay experts to come. You may not have to have protracted legal proceedings or waiting around. The mediation can be a couple of sessions at a mutually convenient time.
That's exactly right. Every judge will tell the parties that it's better to settle and come to a resolution that they agree upon, rather than having a judge make a decision that they probably won't be happy with, because it's not going to be what
100%.
They would have fashioned for themselves.
So both parties may be very unhappy, and it's going to be a very expensive process.
Exactly.
So mediation with the help of the court can help people be more or less happy, let them go on. And what do you think about before that you actually start the process, or maybe before it's complete? Do people sometimes see a marriage counselor or a mediator, and maybe they can achieve a better marriage without getting divorced? Or it's usually your marriage is deteriorated too much by the time they come see you?
By the time they come to me, they've usually exhausted all the other options. I have had some cases where we've gone through litigation and the parties got back together. And usually that's been situations where there were substance abuse issues and the person maintained their sobriety, and they became the person that the other party married, and they're able to be happy together again because that substance abuse issue is no longer there. So sometimes that happens. But generally when people come to me, they've exhausted all their options and they're going forward with a divorce. And the cases that I deal with, my niche is the highly contested divorces, the cases that the parties don't agree on anything and are likely going to court.
What happens next in terms of starting the process?
Well, the first part of the process when the person comes in for a divorce is to find out what it is they're looking for, what their situation is, and what their ultimate objective is, what their goal is in the divorce. Do they want to have custody of the children? Do they want to stay in the marital residence? Do they need spousal support? And once you have all of that information, there's a few ways you can go. One way could just be a letter to the other spouse saying that their spouse has consulted with an attorney about getting a divorce, but they want to resolve it peacefully, amicably, with a settlement. And please call us. That's one way. Another way might be the more aggressive way, which is just starting a summons and complaint and action for divorce in court without any warning to the other side.
And what do you recommend, or it depends on the situation?
It depends on the situation. The parties usually come in knowing their spouse and they know what they would like to do. Some people say, I don't want to go in too aggressively. I want to see if we could try to resolve it. And some people say, there's no way it's ever going to be resolved. We need to go in as aggressively as possible. There really is no cookie cutter situation, although what you're deciding in divorce is always the same. You're always deciding custody if there's children, child support, who's going to stay in the marital residence, and division of the marital assets. But the particular facts and circumstances for each person are completely unique. And that's why you can't just say what you would do in every situation.
And on the flip side, if they go to an attorney who counsels them to have an aggressive posture as opposed to a neutral or open for discussion posture, it takes two lawyers to sit down, two parties to agree to discuss a resolution. If only one party's on board and one attorney's on board, it's not going to happen.
Absolutely right. But that's why it's important. And I wrote a book called You're Getting Divorced Now What? One of the things that I talk about is that when you're choosing an attorney, you should interview that attorney so that you and the attorney are aligned in what your goals are. So if the party wants to resolve it and the attorney doesn't want to resolve it, then you're not aligned, and that's probably not the best fit for you. So
now under that situation, does sometimes the attorney influence the client about whether the case can be resolved?
Yes, absolutely. I think that when somebody retains an attorney, they're looking to that attorney for advice. That's what attorneys are. We're advisors. We're not
a
decision
counselor,
makers.
right?
And we're counselors. So if a client comes to an attorney and says, "Here's what my objective is," the attorney might say, "Well, in this situation, here's your choices that I believe are going to be most successful." And the client's generally going to be taking that advice. That's why they hired the attorney.
And there's usually no downside to having a discussion. I mean, I'm sure you know many of the attorneys on the other side, and you know whether you can have a civilized discussion with them.
Yes, that's so true. Depending on who the opposing counsel is can make a big difference in if the case is going to resolve sooner rather than later. And the attorneys usually know who are the attorneys that will not negotiate and the attorneys that are only going to go to trial and the attorneys who will be amicable and try to negotiate a settlement.
And as you mentioned before, litigation is expensive. So once you take that course, it's just going to be tremendous expenses on both sides. And, both sides may be, not happy because the judge isn't about giving happiness. It's about following certain procedures and certain legal standards. And, they might not help the the litigants, resolve their differences in a cost-effective, timely manner.
And that's true. And it's not that the judges don't want to do that. The judges have very full calendars. They have very full schedules. By the time that the court can get to your case, it might take a long time for you to get a trial date. They might give you a trial date that's 6 to 9 months away. And you can't even get a trial date until you go through all of these other things called discovery and exchanging of documents and possibly depositions. And that whole process itself could take a year or longer. So that's why resolving it sooner is always attractive to the parties because you're not spending
at least trying to reach that goal and
Yes.
see if it can be done, even with the help of an outside mediator.
Correct.
Or the court mediator. I just want to remind our listeners we're talking with Sandra Radna, and she's a matrimonial attorney. Her office is in Melville and also Manhattan, and we'll give you her website a little later. She's the author of the book, You're Getting Divorced Now What? The Ultimate Divorce Guide, which is available on Amazon, and it gives a lot of helpful information at just the cost of the book. And if you missed any part of this podcast or you want to tell someone else about it, just go to nccradio.org, and you're listening on 90.3 WHPC, the voice of Nassau Community College. So what also do you recommend in choosing a divorce lawyer and finding a lawyer that will work for a particular person? I
think that it's very important when choosing a lawyer. I actually put in my book some questions that you can ask because the way that the firm treats you from the first time that you call, are they listening to you? Are they respectful of you? Are they kind to you? Does the attorney have time to speak to you? Does the attorney interrupt you when you're talking, or do they let you finish what you have to say? Are they interested in hearing what your goals are? Those are all things that you want to know because, no pun intended, but the relationship with your divorce attorney is like a marriage. If you're not aligned and if you're not able to speak to each other and you're not able to communicate well, it's not going to work.
And aside from that, you're going to be an advisor and counselor to them, almost maybe a social worker and maybe in some ways a psychologist or a friend or support system. So it's a very close relationship.
Yes.
In good times and bad as they go through the divorce process.
The communication is so important in order for the attorney to be a strong advocate for the client. And if they don't have a good communication process, I even tell in my book, I even say you should find out what the attorney's communication process is. If they can't get in touch with them, can they reach them by email? Can they reach them by text? Is there anything else you could do? For us, we have a secure portal for our clients that has not only me, but the associate and also other, paralegals and everything in the office. This way, they're always getting an immediate response. So people want to know how are they going to be able to communicate with their clients. So that's a good question.
And if they don't give you answers that you can understand or explain your options and the pros and cons of each, then there's going to be problems.
When you meet with the client, once you decide which attorney that you're thinking or considering using, you should meet in person and tell them what your particular situation is and find out what their suggested solutions are. And if they're not able to give you the answers, maybe they're not experienced enough in what your specific situation is, and that might not be the right fit.
And maybe they only have one process in their toolbox, and as you said, there are different ways to try to resolve the divorce at less expense and less animosity.
Yes.
Because especially with kids, they have to go on having some kind of relationship.
Absolutely.
And what about who pays the fees?
Well, that depends in New York. In New York, if there's one spouse that is called the moneyed spouse, meaning the one that makes more money, and say just to use a stereotypical example, that the husband was the more moneyed spouse, the wife was a stay-at-home parent, and she didn't work during the marriage, that moneyed spouse, the husband, will have to pay her attorney's fees. If they're making around the same amount of money, they'll have to pay their own attorney's fees. So it really depends on a case-by-case basis.
And as they're in the initial stages with you evaluating option, do you suggest they make sure they have copies of certain records, especially if they weren't, if one spouse handled the bill paying and the taxes and the assets and the record keeping, that they just make sure, so, be aware of certain records or copy certain records? It's
always best if when someone comes into the beginning of the process, they have a good handle on what their financial assets are, what the incomes of the parties are.
On paper or not.
On paper, or a lot of things are online. But if they don't have that, that's the type of things that the attorneys will ask for in discovery until they get it. But it's always easier if they have it already.
And what are some do's and don'ts to litigants to help them get through the process and have a better landing, a softer landing on the other side?
There's a few. Most importantly, when there's children involved, it's very important not to involve the children in the details of the divorce. It's too much for them. And it doesn't matter if they're young children, teenagers, or adults. The children don't want to be involved in their parents' divorce. And it puts them in a very difficult situation. The other don't alienate one parent against the other. Don't disparage the other parent, because the children have the right to love both parents.
And even if you're not getting divorced, that's good advice.
Yeah, that's right. But when you're saying something bad about the child's parent, well, that parent is half of who the child is. So you're really telling them that half of them is bad too, and it's really not good for the child.
And you're also hurting your own bond with the child. And it's not the best way to resolve problems. Maybe a marriage counselor or some other intermediary. Is there a certain shame or stigma to divorce or someone who's divorced? Or is it a way to solve a problem, that, like a medical problem, like a disease, like an illness, that's not going to go away?
I'm glad you brought that up. The first chapter in my book is called Fear, Shame, Guilt, Sadness, or Just Pissed Off. And it talks about the emotions that you feel when you realize that you're actually getting divorced. And if it wasn't your idea, you might be angry about it. Or if it's a marriage and you all have friends together, you might feel that people are going to think badly of you for getting divorced.
I'm not sure you can help with that.
Yeah, so it's a difficult situation, but it's something that I think you have to realize that everybody goes through that. It is difficult, but once you realize that these are what the emotions are, you have to put them aside, because you have to plan, because you can't think straight when you're blind with rage, or you're, too sad that you can't see through your tears. You have to be able to identify what your emotions are, put them aside, and then plan, because at the end of the day, a divorce is a dissolution of an economic partnership that you had. And you have to be able to plan for that, because the decisions that you make are going to affect your children and your financial future forever.
But going back to what you said earlier, if you're not happy, you have to try to find a path with an attorney's help of moving on, because it may never get better. It may get worse, and you're entitled to happiness.
Correct.
And especially since you might be living a long life, and 50, 60, maybe even 70, you have an opportunity to be happy or happier.
That's right. With people living into their 90s, it's not unusual for people to live into their 90s. So somebody getting married at 68 or 70 might have 20 more years of happiness that they wouldn't have had.
And if you've had years of misery at 40 or 50, not just a bad day, but, a continual process, it's probably not going to get better. There might be social work intervention, but otherwise there's no other way to move on.
That's so true.
I just want to remind our listeners, we're talking about divorce after COVID. Our special guest is Sandra M. Radna, and she has a law firm and is involved in divorce, the practice of divorce and related issues. She has offices in Long Island and also Manhattan. I do want to mention she's also been interviewed on CNBC, NBC, and the New York Times about different celebrity divorces she's been involved in or commented on. What are some other do's and don'ts for someone who's thinking of getting divorced or maybe going through the divorce process?
Don't put everything on social media. Don't put information about what's going on in your divorce on social media. Your children might see it. It'll be very embarrassing for them, and it could come up in court. So once you put it out there on social media and people could see it, it will be used. So that's a really good lesson for people to be aware of. They should not put things on social media.
And what about, friends, relatives? Should you taint the other person? Should you just be matter of fact that I feel there's no other option but to get divorced? How should you let your world know?
I think that depends on who you're speaking to. I think that as human beings, we do need to talk to people about what's going on. And if you have friends, you can absolutely talk to them and let them know what's happening. The difference with social media is that it gets forwarded to other people that maybe shouldn't be seeing it.
So it's good for a personal conversation because you're going to need their support, etc.
Yes, it's just that the children you shouldn't be asking advice from your kids about what to do during your divorce, but you can talk to your parents. Many of my clients come to court with their parents because they need that emotional support, or they come with a good friend. It's very emotional to go to court and to have somebody decide in your life what's more personal than your money and your children. And that's what's being decided in divorce court. So it's highly charged. You're having to put your life aside while you're trying to figure this all out. Everybody wants it done as soon as possible, but everybody wants it done as fairly as possible. And sometimes that takes time. So they should definitely talk to people. Maybe it's going to be a therapist or some type of mental health person that can help you get through it. There are divorce coaches that help people. So there's all different resources for people to help them get through this.
And do you have any suggestions on opening the topic with your friends or maybe your children or other people because you don't want to hold it in. It's just another burden on you at some point if it's happening.
Usually what I suggest with regard to the children, especially young children, is to not say anything to the children until you know what your plan is going to be. So if one person is going to be moving out, the children should be told when they already know where they're going to be living, and the children should hear a united message from the parents, even if they don't tell them at the same time, but that we love you, it has nothing to do with you, we're just not getting along anymore, but your life will stay the same as far as we'll both be in our lives, and here's where you're going to leave.
You will have two loving, caring parents.
That's right. That's the most important thing for them.
And the courts are usually very creative in supporting, let's say, some kind of joint custody and equal treatment, more or less, of the parents.
The courts have repeatedly told us, that the trend is going towards 50-50 custody, meaning that the children spend an equal amount of time with each parent, and that could be fashioned in a number of different ways. They could be, for example, the child or the children are with one parent on Monday, Tuesdays, and the other parent Wednesday, Thursdays, and then they alternate the weekends. Or it could be 1 week with one parent, 1 week with another parent. There's all different things. It varies depending on the age of the children, what can be done. And if both parents have the time to do that, that's the best. If they live near each other, it makes it easier for the children.
And the other issue, I guess, will be support going on and the ability of one spouse to support themselves, after the divorce. And what's how are some of those issues resolved?
Well, New York State has statutory formulas, meaning formulas by law, on how to determine the amount of spousal support, which New York calls maintenance, and how to determine the amount of child support. It's based on the number of children you have and based on what we call statutory caps. And they figure out the formula based on the income of the parties. And also, the marital assets are divided between the parties. So usually between the assets that are being divided and the spousal support, the less money spouse should be able to get back on their feet. And the person who's doing the paying is also having a financial burden, because what used to be all as together in one family, they now have to support 2 different households, so it's difficult for them too. So everybody has to kind of reassess how they're going to move on after divorce. But usually once the bill of the divorce attorney is gone and once everything's resolved, people do start building things back up and they're able to move on with their lives.
And sometimes you're called in to resolve post-divorce issues.
Correct.
And what are some of those about?
Well, when you get divorced, you have something called, in New York, called a stipulation of settlement. The rest of the country, they might just call it a divorce agreement, and it'll cover all different topics. If after the divorce, one of the parties does not adhere to what it says in that stipulation of settlement, then you would go back to court to enforce it. That's why it's very important when you have a stipulation of settlement that it's very specific, because the court will only enforce it based on what the court calls the 4 corners of that agreement, like what's specifically in that agreement. So if it's too general, such as we're going to divide the retirement accounts, but it doesn't name what the retirement account is, how much was in it, what the address of the plan is, and when it's going to be done, and there's no court order doing that division, then it might never be able to be determined how to divide that, and it might not be able to get done.
And if there are, sometimes there are problems with custody and visitation as well, and sometimes a few phone calls can resolve them. Otherwise, you have to go to court.
Right. It could be based on child support. It could be one parent not giving access to the other parent. It could be one parent saying bad things to the children about the other parent, and those are all things that would be violations of a well-written agreement that you would go back to court for.
And as you mentioned before, it's probably not a good idea during the divorce or after divorce
to talk about
disparaging the other parent.
Absolutely. It's not good for the children.
And can you give us your website? And I assume you have helpful, useful information to people and also a way for them to contact you.
Yes, thank you. My website is www.radnalaw, R-A-D as in David, N as in Nancy, A-L-A-W.com.
And any final thoughts?
I would say the final thoughts is that if you want to get through a divorce, the best way, be respectful to each other, even if you don't like each other. Look at the best way to dissolve your economic partnership so you're not spending all the money on the attorneys, and always think about what's best for the children before you say something about the other parent.
And I guess people consult with you about the possibilities and maybe they're not ready for a divorce, but they just understand what it might look like economically and custody-wise and opportunities it offers as well.
Yes, your first consultation with an attorney should give you a good strategy.
And give you ideas on what's possible and what's not.
Yes.
And just give us your website one more time.
www.radnalaw.com.
I just want to thank Sandra M. Radna for being our guest on Law You Should Know. As you know, she's a matrimonial attorney, and her website is Radna, R-A-D-N-A, law.com. And if you missed any part of this program or you want to tell someone else about it, the podcast is available at nccradio.org. Anything you've heard is just general information, and you have to consult an attorney for legal advice applicable to your situation. And please join us here on 90.3 WHPC, the voice of Nassau Community College, next week at the same time for another program on Law You Should Know.